Hi, boys and girls. It is the creator of Bored with Miss Reynolds, Better Off Reading Every Day, and I have a good one for you. This one is called Mr. Puffer's Bill. Train Engineer, a Little Golden Book. And back in the day, this was 39 cents. And I have all my little train friends right here. And we are going to find out what's going on with Mr. Puffer Bill. Mr. Puffer Bill was an engineer on the Red-Bird Railroad. He was very proud of his engine, Chuff, and of all the railroad cars Chuff pulled. Rain or shine, they went from Cotton in the Valley up to the steep mountains of Pumpkin Ridge and back again. When the sun shone, Mr. Puffer Bill was happy to put his head out of the Chuff's cab and watch the tracks ahead. Mr. Puffer Bill enjoyed the bright sun shining on his head. He liked to feel the warm wind whistling by his ears. But sometimes the day was rainy and the wind was cold. When that happened, the rain hit the top of Mr. Puffer Bill's head. The wind turned his ears blue. Brrr. Mr. Puffer Bill was cold. Me, oh my, I do need a hat to keep my head and my ears warm, said Mr. Puffer Bill. So he tried on a straw hat. But it didn't keep his ears warm, not at all. He tried on a tall silk hat, but every time it blew right off his head. He tried on a sailor's hat, but that looked rather silly. He was an engineer on a train, not a sailor on a ship. One day, Mrs. Puffer Bill had an idea. She gave Mr. Puffer Bill her red bandana to wear. He wrapped it neatly around his head. The bandana kept him warm, but he felt very strange wearing it. An engineer should not wear a lady's bandana, said Mr. Puffer Bill. One stormy day, Mr. Puffer Bill wore Mrs. Puffer Bill's bandana to Pumpkin Ridge. He held on to the bandana very tight. Then Mr. Puffer Bill put his head out of Chuff's cab to watch the tracks ahead. And he saw, of all things, a cow standing on the tracks. She was standing there, smack in the middle, eating a daisy. Goodness gracious, said Mr. Puffer Bill, and he tooted Chuff's whistle loud and long. The cow jumped from the tracks. She said, "Moo!" and opened her brown eyes wide. Poor Mr. Puffer Bill was very upset by all this. I hope nothing more happens, he said. and he held on tight to Mrs. Puffer Bill's bandana. Then Mr. Puffer Bill watched the tracks ahead as Chuff went around the curve. And he saw, of all things, 2 sheep. They were walking on the tracks, walking smack in the middle, looking for green grass. Goodness gracious, dear. Oh, dear, said Mr. Puffer Bill, and he tooted Chuff's whistle twice. Toot, toot. This made one sheep say, bah, and go to the right. It made the other sheep say, bah, bah, and go to the left. My, they were excited. Poor Mr. Puffer Bill was very, very upset by all this. I hope nothing more happens, he said, and he held on tight to Mrs. Puffer Bill's bandana. Then he watched the tracks ahead as Chuff went over the railroad bridge. And he saw, of all things, 3 white ducks waddling down the tracks, waddling smack in the middle, looking for a place to swim. Goodness gracious me, oh my, said Mr. Puffer Bill, and he tooted Chuff's whistle 3 times. Toot, toot, toot. This made the ducks waddle slowly off the tracks. They said quack, 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 right back at Mr. Puffer Bill. My, they were silly. For poor Mr. Puffer Bill, this was too much. He was upset, so upset. He forgot to hold on to Mrs. Puffer Bill's bandana. Whoosh! The wind blew it from his head. Now the bandana lay on the ground, somewhere between Cotton in the Valley and the top of Pumpkin Ridge. Oh, the bandana flew off. When Mr. Puffer Bill came home, he sat in his cozy, warm kitchen. Mrs. Puffer Bill gave him a cup of cambric tea. In a rather quiet voice, Mr. Puffer Bill said, I lost your bandana. In a rather loud voice, Mrs. Puffer Bill said, I'm going to invent a hat that will stay on my head. Excuse me. In a rather loud voice, Mr. Puffer Bill said, I'm going to invent a hat that will stay on my head. Mrs. Puffer Bill gave Mr. Puffer Bill a piece. Mrs. Puffer Bill gave Mr. Puffer Bill a piece of cloth with a blue and white stripes on it. Then Mr. Puffer Bill sat at the kitchen table and started to invent. With Mrs. Puffer Bill's needle and thread, he sewed his way and that way on the cloth until he sewed a hat together. Mrs. Puffer Bill was so proud. Mr. Puffer Bill knew how to invent. Mr. Puffer Bill put on that hat he had invented and looked in the mirror. Fine, just fine, said Mr. Puffer Bill, except my hat does not look like a hat. It looks like a cap. Well, so it does, agreed Mrs. Puffer Bill. The next day, when Mr. Puffer Bill went to work, he pulled his new cap snug over his ears. A band that stretched to fit his head made the cap stay in place. The wind couldn't blow the cap off anymore, not even if he tooted Chug's whistle at 1 cow, 2 sheep, 3 ducks, not ever. Mr. Puffer Bill was so pleased with his new cap, He gave Chug's whistle a toot toot that echoed from Cotton Valley clear to the top of Pumpkin Ridge. Now, the next time you see an engineer on a train, please look at his cap. It is just like the one Mr. Puffer Bill invented not so long ago. And that is the end of Mr. Puffer Bill, Train Engineer. Boys and girls, it is Bored with Miss Reynolds, better off reading every day. I don't own the rights to this book that I have read to you, but I love storytelling magic. And the magic of today's story is there was a problem. His wife tried to help. It worked for a little bit, and then it didn't. He had to find a different solution, which made him invent the cap. And that is my favorite page in this book, when he was sewing. Because I don't think you know that Miss Reynolds loves to sew. And that's why I'm channeling his blue and white striped cap with my blue and white striped shirt. That's how we put it together, along with all of our Thomas friends. I hope that you enjoyed this book as much as I did. I learned a little something, which I did not know before, how the engineer's cap came to be. And now every time I ride the railroad, I'll be looking out and thinking of how Mr. Pufferville came up with this invention. I hope that you are out there having yourself a good time. And if you see a problem and there's something that you could do to fix it, whether it be for yourself or for someone else to make their life a little bit easier, I hope that you will go ahead and do that. Because what do we want out of life? We want fun, we want education, we want love, and we love great inventions. Kind of like how Bored with Miss Reynolds was invented when we went into quarantine and I wanted to find a way to stay in touch with my kids. And that's how this came to be. I was reading to my kids on a regular basis, and now years later, I'm still reading to you guys on a whole different level, but it's all the same love. I'll see you again soon. Bye. We are off to our next adventure. My friends and I, and Mr. and Mrs. Pufferbill.